Hey guys, welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be reacting to
Worse than Greece. Is Japan's debt at breaking point? Why is Greece catching
what?
strays over here?
This video is brought to you by Brilliant. When inflation ticked up across the world a couple of years ago, most
Now
governments were
Japan?
understandably
I'm
anxious
sure
about
this is going to be a conversation about Japan.
Every country? Well, not every country. America, China, Japan.
its politically toxic consequences. Perhaps the one exception, however, was Japan, where policymakers were quietly optimistic that some supply-side inflation could finally push Japan out of its deflationary funk, and perhaps return Japan's uniquely debt-laden economy back to normality. Somewhat unsurprisingly, however, it turns out that normalising monetary and fiscal policy, when your debt-to-GDP ratio is over 200%, is pretty difficult. And last week, Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba warned voters that, quote, Japan's fiscal situation is worse than Greece's. Unfortunately for Ishiba, in the past
Listen, that's not that bad. Greece situation is decent. We've been reacting to a lot of Greece. Like they're okay. So saying it's worse than Greece is not as bad as you think it is. Unless you're talking 2008 Greece, but then you should be more specific, because Greece is no longer that.
couple of days, things have suddenly got a lot worse, after a sharp sell-off in Japanese bonds pushed Japan's long-term borrowing costs to unprecedented levels. So, in this video, we're going to have a look at Japan's efforts to normalise its economy, the looming debt crisis, and what might happen next. By endless news stories, cast up against decades of rapid economic growth, with the Japanese economy growing by an average of 7% every year from 1955 to 1990. However, in the 90s, Japan suffered from a series of economic shocks in quick succession. After a massive boom in the 80s, in the decade after 1990, residential house prices fell by more than 50%. Commercial property prices fell by
at the same time.
something like 85%, and Japan's main stock index, the Nikkei 225, fell by about 75%. Japan's economy entered a period of stagnation, with both growth and inflation falling close to zero. In an attempt to stimulate the economy and get it growing again, Japan's central bank, the Bank of Japan, or BOJ, bought up billions of yen's worth of government bonds, essentially printing money and giving it to the government to spend. This didn't really work, and when the Japanese economy took yet another hit after the 2008 financial crisis, the BOJ also started buying up corporate debt, essentially printing money and giving it straight to Japanese companies. In this sense, the BOJ pioneered many of the techniques that Western central banks would go on to use after the 2008 financial crisis and the pandemic. Unfortunately for the BOJ, this still wasn't enough to get Japan out of its stagflationary funk, and both growth and inflation stuck stubbornly close to zero, while the Japanese government's debt burden ballooned to more than 240% of GDP, probably the highest in the world. That was until early 2022, when the inflationary shock that swept across the world pushed Japan's annual inflation rate above 2% for the first time in nearly a decade. Japanese policymakers saw this as an opportunity to essentially bring the Japanese economy back to normality by using this inflationary episode to trigger a mild wage price spiral, which would keep inflation persistently above zero. In other words, Japanese policymakers wanted workers to demand higher wages in the face of higher prices, which would mean more spending power.
So instead of giving people that higher wages, they said they wanted people to demand higher. So they they wanted. Oh my! The wording he used, I don't know if it's accidentally or is that really happened. But if that's how it is, that you're not gonna give them unless they ask. So but you want them to ask, but you don't.
That's crazy.
That's crazy.
Power for Japanese households and therefore higher prices, etc. Slightly higher inflation could also drive economic growth by encouraging Japanese households to spend money instead of saving it and letting inflation eat away at its real value. And, well, this sort of happened. While wages lagged behind inflation in 2022 and 2023, in 2024, the average wage growth for workers at large companies came in at above 5%, the highest since 1991. Japanese policymakers were optimistic that, once inflation had become self-sustaining, they could normalise monetary and fiscal policy. The BOJ wouldn't have to constantly buy government and corporate debt to keep the economy out of deflation, and, if inflation and growth were up, the Japanese government would enjoy higher tax revenues, and so wouldn't have to issue as much debt. If Japan could achieve these three things, persistent inflation, the end of quantitative easing, and relatively balanced budgets, its economy would suddenly look a lot more normal. However, it turns out transitioning from a stagflationary economy into a quote-unquote normal economy is pretty difficult. For starters, that mild wage price spiral that policymakers were imagining has quickly become more severe. Inflation has stayed above the BOJ's 2% target since 2022, and has actually risen in recent months to around 4%. Japanese consumers, who are used to stable prices, have reacted furiously at the recent price rises, especially for staple grains like rice, putting pressure on the government to cut its consumption tax. Furthermore, this inflation has forced the BOJ to raise its benchmark interest rate to 0.5%, the highest since 2008.
So negative interest, how does that work? Your loan amount of owed shrinks over time? Never seen that before.
I don't even have an answer.
Never
A
seen negative interest. So
The bank owe you money.
the bank owe you, yeah, you take out the loan and bank owe you money, and well, you owe, but you owe money, but as long as you keep making payments, the government pays a little bit off for you. Not the government, but the bank cuts it off a little. Huh? Never seen that before.
This might not sound too high, but because Japan's debt pile is so enormous, even a slight increase in interest rates causes a massive increase in servicing costs. Japan now expects to spend something like 32 trillion yen on debt servicing next year, representing about 5% of GDP.
Wow, so America is not as bad as Japan. We're third.
More than almost any other country. So you get the idea. Japan's attempt to normalize its economy
That was
has put
just
massive
interest
pressure
paid on the debt.
Yeah, so we're not paying that bad that interest compared to Japan. That's what I meant.
on the government's finances, both because the cost of debt servicing has increased and because there's renewed political pressure to ease the cost of living crisis. And this problem has suddenly started looking particularly acute in the past couple of days after Japan's bond yield spiked to levels not seen in decades. The yield on both 30 and 40-year Japanese bonds, for instance, is currently over 3%, the highest Japan's long-term borrowing costs have been since probably the 1980s. So what happened here? Well, some of it's a consequence of a similar rise in US bond yields, with the yield on both 30 and 40-year treasuries spiking after Moody's, one of the big credit rating agencies, downgraded America's credit rating, citing America's unsustainable debt burden. For complicated reasons, other countries' bond yields generally track treasuries, which is why Japan, the UK, and European economies all saw an increase in long-term borrowing costs at the same time. Some of it was because of a conspicuously weak bond auction a couple of days ago, when the Japanese government tried to issue more than 20-year bonds, only to find out that no one really wanted to buy them. But perhaps the fundamental reason is that, well, the market just don't think Japan can afford any more debt. Japan's debt pile is already massive. Japanese growth is weak, with GDP contracting in the first quarter of this year, and markets just don't trust that Ishiba, who's remarkably unpopular at the moment, has the political capital to impose the fiscal discipline required to make good on Japan's debts. This all presents the Bank of Japan with a difficult dilemma. Does it trust Ishiba to sort out the fiscal mess? Or does it restart buying government debt, easing the pressure on Ishiba, but tacitly admitting that Japan's economy will probably never return to normality? This would also risk throwing a spanner into the ongoing trade negotiations with the US, given that return to ultra-loose monetary policy would probably weaken the yen, something Trump has complained about in the past. All in all, there doesn't seem to be an easy way out of this fiscal mess, and it looks like bringing Japan's economy back to normal will be frustratingly difficult. If you're engaged with
I wonder how the people are doing. Like, what does this mean?
This is, I do not know Japan had it this bad. That's unfortunate for them, yeah.
Can I see the comments? Maybe someone can give insight.
This is not good. I just don't know why they making Greece catch strays though. What did Greece do to y'all? As a non-economist, it feels like the outcome of government chasing good numbers instead of focusing on producing actual value. That's a good point. That's a good point, yeah. You see, this is why lack of immigration is a problem for politicians. When there are no immigrants to blame, the politicians actually have to take the blame. Wow, well, LDP.
I wonder what's the population size of immigrants in Japan.
I don't know, but their population, like a lot of countries are not doing good. They're shrinking, so that's a problem. LDP, we aren't managing the economy well, Japanese voter base, but we'll vote for you anyway.
Guys, of course, let us know your thoughts. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Join the Discord. And as always, share as much kindness as possible.